From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. China's two sessions are underway, with policymakers outlining the country's priorities for the year ahead. In the year 2026, the 2026 Government Work Report, Premier Li Qiang set a GDP growth target of 4 to 5%. The government is also adopting a more proactive fiscal stance, including expanded bond issuance and investment programs. While further boosting consumption through trade-in programs and other measures, China is also accelerating structural transformation with new quality productive forces in sectors such as AI, integrated circuits, aerospace, and biomedicine. And future industries like quantum technology and 6Gs are also being nurtured. As China moves from the 14th to the 15th five-year plan period, what are the key signals from this year's two sessions? And what do they tell us about China's economic trajectory? Now, joining us today, we're profoundly honored to have with us in Hong Kong, China, Dr. Li Qiang, founding director of the Center on Contemporary China and the World at the University of Hong Kong. In Shanghai, we have John Ross, senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University. In Beijing, we have Joseph Oliver Mendu, Deputy Director of the International Exchange Department at the China-Africa Business Council. And last and certainly not least, Professor Wang Guan, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Dr. Li, always great to have you with us and pick your mind. Let me ask you about the ongoing two sessions. The upcoming 15th five-year plan is being scrutinized by China watchers. The GDP growth, remain within a reasonable range, 4.5 to 5%, while R&D expenditure is expected to grow by more than 7%. What do you think this says about China's innovation trajectory going forward as part of its overall developmental goal?
This is a clear indication that China moved from the high-speed growth to high-quality growth, with emphasis on technology and innovation. This is partly because of the fact that China's economic model has shifted from export or property-driven growth to technology innovation-driven growth, partly reacted to international environment in terms of competition in science technology, and also related with the fact a contract with President Donald Trump obsessed with oil, the older resources, but China look at the new resources, look at the IT industry, look at the new minerals, and etc. Now, this is a very, very important development, but China has the capacity to have the 7% research and development growth. As we know that in the US with Biden or Trump, a difficulty to afford this kind of high budget on science technology. Now, also China is ahead of its the new technology in terms of new energy, alternative energy, and also the industry upgrade, the new wave of urbanization. That all these things will put China as a leader in terms of technological competition in today's world, and also emphasize on new clean energy and also new development model.
I mean, over the years, Dr. Li, do you see all these strategic guidances and strategic industrial policies coming to fruition when it comes to reducing reliance, reducing external shocks, and having China's indigenous innovation capacities coming of age and becoming a leader, a trailblazer for the world?
Absolutely, this is not necessarily a choice, but also a necessity. But certainly China chose the right course. And because the environmental cost for single-minded economic growth will not lead to a right direction. Chinese government, especially over the past 15 years, that emphasize the green development. So this certainly reflects that China's strategic shift. This is the right direction to move. And again, that will resonate very well with many other countries, for example, ASEAN countries and European countries. They are also very much concerned about the environment, about the necessity for new development model, emphasize on new energy rather than the traditional energy.
Right. The overall target of the GDP has been announced. That is, a growth target of between 4.5 to 5%. I want to ask Professor Wang Guan here. What signals did you pick up from this macroeconomic target as this very number or a range of numbers have been closely scrutinized?
Well, I think this reflects the fact that China's economy is more becoming like a developed economy where growth rates typically range between 1% to 3%. I mean, 3% is considered very high growth for a developed economy. And China is certainly moving in that direction. If you look at the GDP per capita, I think China is very close to the upper higher income class as according to the World Bank's national income classification scheme. So I think this is a reality, and on the top of this, I think the fact that I remember this is the first time that the growth target is set for a range as opposed to a point estimate. Yeah. I think this shows that we still have uncertainties and challenges faced both domestically and internationally. So that's why we set a range this time. And also keep in mind that I think in these days, the growth number is not probably as important as say the quality of the growth, right? I mean, you can have the same 4.5% growth for a sort of a economy growth mostly coming from traditional industries. If this growth number is coming more from these emerging, rising industries as being stipulated in this document, 6 emerging industries they're talking about, over 10 trillion yuan scale kind of industries, and that's going to be a huge difference in my view. So I think both from a quality perspective as well as a quantity perspective, I think this range is quite reasonable. And also, last thing I want to say about this topic is that there's also another sentence followed by Premier Li when he says, when he announces this range, he said that we'll try our best to achieve the high end of this range, right? So realistically, I'm thinking about maybe 4.7, 4.8%. This is probably something that maybe Premier Li has in mind, and I would bet my money on a target like this for the rest of the year.
I mean, I think many would agree that there's only so much a GDP figure can tell about the real health or the composition or the overall the status of a country's well-being and its capacity to generate growth and fair growth. Now, Professor Ross, China is placing strong emphasis on new quality productive forces, especially in areas such as artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and semiconductors. From a global perspective, where do you think China's technology and manufacturing sectors currently stand in international value chain, and how might this wave of industrial upgrading reshape global economic competition and cooperation?
Well, I think that during the last 5-year plan, the 14th, China achieved something which has never been achieved before by a developing country in history. And I think this is underestimated, which is it became a technological leader in a series of important industries. Previously, you've had developing countries which grew fast. They didn't grow as fast as China, but nevertheless, they grew fast. But none of them has ever become a technological leader. But now China is, and it's now internationally acknowledged in EVs, renewable energy, drones, areas of telecommunications, areas of pharmaceuticals, etc. And this has been driven by 2 big macroeconomic processes. One is the high level of R&D. China spends almost twice as much on R&D as a percentage of GDP as any other developing country, and it's already overtaken 3 of the G7 countries. And secondly, it's very high level of investment, because it means if somebody has an innovation, which is what the R&D propels, it can be turned into a product much more rapidly than any other country. Roughly speaking, China invests twice as much as the US, for example, in absolute terms. I don't mean percentage terms. So that means I'm sure that Chinese R&D specialists and American R&D specialists are equally intelligent. But the difference is that for every dollar that is behind an American R&D specialist, there's $2 behind a Chinese one. And that's why China, for example, in EVs, 5 years ago, China was almost nowhere as as an exporter of cars. Now it's become the world's largest car exporter. So it's these two big macroeconomic processes, the high level of R&D and the high level of investment, that allows China to achieve what no developing country has ever achieved before. And of course, that defines its position in the world as now. I don't know how many industries China's technological leader now, but I'll bet it's twice as many by the end of the 15th five-year plan.
Innovation is key. Now, Joseph, or shall I say, Mendu 老师, now, China continues to stress high quality opening up in this year's government work report, including expanding market access in sectors such as telecommunications, aerospace, biotechnology, and healthcare. From your perspective, how significant is this new round of opening up for strengthening global economic cooperation and resilience of multilateralism?
Okay, well, I see this as a watershed moment for global economic cooperation, especially with emerging economies, including African countries. You have to know that for decades, cooperation was heavily focused on infrastructure and natural resources, which is the hardware of development. But this new round of opening up is about software, and which is the knowledge of economy and the digital spine, or even the biological frontier. So I think, in my sense, by opening up these high-tech sectors, China is actually giving signals that it is no longer just a manufacturer of goods, but China is now moving towards being a co-creator of solutions. And for Africa, for instance, this is an invitation to collaborate on cutting-edge problems. So we can move from simply buying telecom equipment, for example, to co-developing 5G or 6G solutions tailored to Africa's unique geographic needs. And we can also partner on biotech research to tackle diseases prevalent in tropical climates and so on. This opening up also framed around market access and investment, not aid. That's very important. It actually treats emerging economies as partners and markets in their own right. And this is a fundamental shift that aligns with Africa's push for agencies and self-determinations. So it's basically saying, in few words, come, invest, and grow with us, rather than we will build this for you. So this is very important, and this fosters a more mature and sustainable and mutually beneficial form of cooperation.
Yeah, we do need a new prototype when it comes to China-Africa cooperation, not just exploiting, resources, but really to build capacity, empower individuals, as Africa is the youngest continent anywhere in the world. Professor Lee, another major theme in this year's policy agenda is expanding domestic demand, consumer consumption, and improving people's well-being, of course. Now, you wrote about China's middle class. You compared the middle class in Shanghai versus that in New York. Given your extensive studies, how do you think we can kick in a virtuous cycle of boosting domestic demand while strengthening social well-being, instead of letting a downward spiral continue?
You mentioned downward spiral. To a certain extent, the middle class, whether it be developing country or developed country, or so-called the East and the West, they all faces challenges because of unemployment, because of AI and technology development. But having said that, I think China has a very impressive middle class growth. It did not exist 30 years ago, but China, India, and ASEAN countries become the driving force for middle class expansion. And China now has a 400 million middle class, making China the largest middle class market, both 30% of China's population and 30% of global middle class. Now, Chinese government also emphasized on a new wave of urbanization with a new development model. Now, I remember that a few years ago, Premier Li Qiang had an international conference which I attended. He mentioned that if China increased 1% of urbanization, which currently China's urbanization is about 68% of the population, then that means 14 million people will move from rural area to urban area. That will stimulate domestic spending, domestic kind of development model. So I think that to make China is a far more competitive stage compared with the other countries, particularly in the West, whether Europe or North America, middle class is shrinking. But also China has a fascinating, stage of the transportation, as I live in the Bay Area, so every 10 minutes or 5 minutes, there's a faster train leaving from any major cities in the Bay Area. So that consumption certainly will be very, very helpful. So as long as the people are very, very dynamic, China's domestic spending will grow. And eventually, that China's middle class will also have a very fast rate of growth. So that make me more optimistic about China's overall development, especially the government strategy, enlargement of middle income group or middle class in the Western world, the term they use.
Yeah, thanks for all these great insights. Now, Professor Wang Guan, the upcoming 5-year period also sets a target of reducing carbon emissions per unit of GDP by around 17% as China accelerates its green transition. From an economic standpoint, how can green technology development and industrial upgrading move toward, especially towards promoting this new quality productive forces?
Well, I think 17% is quite an ambitious target. It goes to testify, China's great responsibility to the world, to mankind, that we are indeed climate change believers. We are fully committed to reducing carbon emission, and also I think it testifies to China's commitment to the international community. We are a manufacturing powerhouse, and I think reducing carbon emission from a manufacturing perspective is extremely important. I mean, our manufacturing activities account for about 30% of the global manufacturing activities. So we can reduce some carbon emission for that part. That's already a huge contribution to the world. And I think this is also important in the sense that also benefits China's own economic growth in the sense that China is at the cutting edge of providing green tech products and services. There are many Chinese companies that are dominant on international stage in, for example, solar panels, in wind power manufacturing. So these opportunities itself create economic growth for China. It creates value added, creates GDP from China's perspective. So I think it's it's sort of beneficial from two perspectives, both from a supply perspective as well as from a demand perspective. So I think this is a tall order in my view, 17% over such a long period of time. But I think it's extremely important compared to other, especially compared to the United States, that doesn't believe in the climate change at all. Yeah. President Trump's talking about baby Joe. We are fully committed to alternative energies as opposed to fossil fuels. I think that's a sharp contrast, and in that regard, I think we have a lot of room. There's a lot of room for cooperation between China and the European Union and Japan and other industrialized countries.
Yeah, China and Europe are partners, not adversaries. That is the message from the Chinese foreign minister 2 days ago at a key press conference. Now, Professor Ross, despite global uncertainties, China seems to be, one of the very few countries that kept emphasizing on the importance of multilateralism, on defending and strengthening UN, which is not perfect, as was acknowledged by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, how do you see the future role of China in supporting global economic recovery, given the shocks, the conflicts, and the proxy wars going on around the world, especially recently in the Middle East?
Well, technically, I'm senior fellow, not professor. But on the shocks, at the moment, what I see is that the world economy is dividing really into two tracks. One track is the United States, which is turning to protectionism. Unfortunately, not only under President Trump, but unfortunately, Biden didn't reverse the various tariffs that were introduced. So it's going into protectionism, but most of the world doesn't. And the United States is less than 20% of world GDP. And less than 20% of world trade. And in particular, the most rapidly growing economies don't want to go protectionism. And the really big growing economies at the present time are the big global South economies. China is the biggest, but India is growing very fast and will be the third largest contributor to world GDP growth this year, according to the IMF. That is, after China will be number one, the United States will be number two, but India will be number three. Indonesia is growing very fast. Vietnam's growing very fast. They don't want to turn to protectionism. Why should they? They're doing very well. It's in their interests. And therefore, they're not going to do it. Then Europe is hesitating between the two. Economically, it should go with China, and therefore that's why you've had a series of European leaders coming to China recently, but it's under pressure from the United States, so it hasn't yet quite made up its mind. But the question of the globalization is going to continue. I think that Foreign Minister Wang Yi, quoting President Xi Jinping, said, there's a broad ocean of globalization, and it's a big mistake to get yourself into small seas or small lakes. So it's not really the world turning towards protectionism. It's one country, a very powerful country. I don't want to underestimate that. It can create a lot of problems for imports into the United States, that is exports to the US, but it can't control world trade. That's why, although China's exports to the US have fallen considerably, China's overall exports haven't. But within this global South, it needs a large, what you might call, anchor economy. And that is what China provides. So it's on the same path as particularly the big global South countries. And I think that will ensure that the overall process of internationalization will continue. And China's become the mainstay of international trade and globalization.
Now, Joseph, you're nodding your head. What opportunities do you think China's two sessions policy signals present the global South and for the future of South-South cooperation?
Well, I think China's economic health is definitely intertwined with the global and particularly with the developing world prosperity. And from the African perspective, I think China's continued opening up and growth is fundamentally important. I think I would give two reasons. First of all, I think for developing economies, predictability is very precious, because when major Western economy face uncertainty, it sends shock waves through our markets. It affects also our currencies, and also it reduces demand for exports. But China's commitment to stable, high quality, and growth provides a critical counter-cyclical anchor for the global economy. It also offers a degree of stability that allows us to plan our own long-term development under the African continental free trade area with more confidence. And the second is, I think, as China's middle class grows also and its economy shifts towards consumption, the demand for high quality, unique product expands. So China has already opened its doors wide open to African goods. I attended the Foreign Minister Wang Yi presser, a few days ago, and he actually did mention from May 1st, 2026, this year, China will implement a zero tariff policy for all products from 53 African countries that have diplomatic ties. And this continued growth, it means even greater demand for African agricultural products, but also for manufactured goods and eventually services too. So it provides a powerful incentive for Africa to industrialize and process raw materials to meet the standards and tastes of the Chinese consumer. So it directly supports Africa's goal of moving up the value chain.
Yeah, China-Africa relations is always in focus. So is China-U.S. relations. Dr. Lee, it's hard to let you go without asking you a question about China-U.S. relations, as you were leading the China section of one of the world's most prestigious and influential think tanks back in our Washington days. So, picking up the signals from Trump, whereby he says he may be ending the war with Iran pretty soon, and the China's latest remarks on from Wang Yi, hoping that the year 2026 may be a year of stable and healthy China-U.S. engagement. What do you think is a more likely trajectory of China-U.S. relations this year and beyond?
Well, certainly China-U.S. relations facing some structural problem. The structural problem largely reflects that the U.S. domestic divides and also geopolitical landscape change with China's growing power and the U.S. feel sense of fear and etc. But the good thing is that the leaders of both countries want to meet. If as a schedule, there will be as many as 4 meetings this year. Of course, we don't know. This also largely depend on whether Iran war will last for too long and how Donald Trump will deal with all the challenges it faces. But the latest signal, it sounds like he still will come to China. And also he recently said he will end the war soon. Now, China can play a very, very important role in terms of negotiation and the peace making. Of course, U.S. should take main responsibility. But whether it be Russian-Ukraine war or Middle East or some other areas, China will play a very positive force. So I think that there will be some chance that as long as the two top leaders will meet, I think that the relationship will not be completely decoupled, and they found some common ground or converging interests or even converging vision. I think that will avoid major crises. I think the Chinese leaders, especially Wang Yi recently just said, he also said in the Munich Security Conference, China will be a positive force in that regard. So let's see what will happen. Now, certainly there's some events is still unfolding. For example, Japanese Prime Minister will visit the U.S. China will monitor very, very closely. China also will look at the U.S. weapon sales to Taiwan. These also make China will be very, very tough in terms of negotiation with the United States.
Yeah, those are the core issues that concerns Beijing, gravely. Professor Wang Guan, anything to add when it comes to China-U.S. ties in the months ahead?
Yeah, well, I think at a very fundamental level, President Trump has a very different foreign policy perspective here, especially regarding China. I think this is very different from previous policies. Now, the problem is that when we talk about American foreign policy, it's not just President Trump's personal view about this. He's also running into a very thick war, essentially. A war consisting of those people who are deeply entrenched in the usually what we call the deep state, people in the State Department and Pentagons and intelligence community. Those people have been sort of engaged in anti-China activities for their entire life, and it's their living. It's a whole industry out there. So when President Trump adopts a foreign policy that's different from his predecessors, these people, I don't think they're very much enamored with this idea. The country's moving in that direction. And it's very likely that a lot of these people will do everything possible to essentially resist and sabotage President Trump's agenda. That's the big problem. We've already seen a couple of things like this happen in the past. So I think it's going to take some time. And, the China-U.S. relationship is also very much subject to, the internal politics within the United States. I'm talking about not just partisan politics, but also sort of politics within the deep state, within the administration. There were different views about, China policy from Washington's perspective. I think there are still a lot of uncertainties, and thankfully, President Trump, every time he talks about China, he's always talking about very good relationship with President Xi, and that's a very good sign. And hopefully, what he's thinking about China policy will prevail in Washington.
I want to thank all of our panelists for their great insights on these very important set of issues. John, Joseph, Dr. Lee, and Professor Wang Guan, thank you all so very much. That will do it for this edition of The Hub. Thank you for watching. Our programs continue on CGTN. Stay tuned and see you next time.